Well, good morning and welcome to Stroke of Genius Podcast Executive Experience. I'm your host, Aaron Avila. I'm CEO and founder of Stroke TV Media. My guest today, I'm really excited to introduce you to. He's a physicist. His name, I'm pretty sure I'm going to butcher his name, but try. His Paul Shotton. And he'll correct me on my last name, but he's a physicist. And I want you to realize that you are in for a treat because you have a physicist that projects. Well, we'll get into it. I'll get into it. But Paul, let me bring Paul on the camera. Hold on just a second.
Welcome to the Stroke of Genius Show, Executive Experience. And now, here's your host, CEO Aaron Avila.
Well, good morning, Paul.
Good morning, Aaron. It's my pleasure to join you.
Good to see you. I mean, with the people don't know, but we had some technical issues in the beginning, and we just got on the camera. So I'm great to be here. I really am happy here.
Indeed.
All right, we only get half an hour together. So I'm going to let you introduce yourself to speed up because I can talk only slow. But so would you please, for the audience, please introduce yourself.
Okay, so my name's Paul Shotton. As Aaron mentioned before, I trained as a physicist, although I haven't been a practicing physicist for many years. I've been an investment banker, risk manager, trader for the bulk of my career. And now I advise companies on fundraising, how to organize their programs and so on. And I've recently written a book called Doomed to Fail. And it's interesting, I think, because it takes some ideas originally going back to the late 19th century, but there's a lot of developments in the world of physics in the late 1980s, 1990s. And it takes some ideas, particularly ideas of complex adaptive systems. And I explain in the book why these are relevant to human societies, because we as humans have individual agency. Human societies, the way that we behave, the way that we interact with one another, our political frameworks, our economy is a complex adaptive system. And that's important for reasons that I go on to discuss in the book.
Yeah, do me a favor, just break down adaptive systems for me in a more basic terms here, please.
Yeah, so they have a number of very important properties. Their complexity has to do with the fact that they are highly non-linear. We're used to systems which behave in a linear way. We make a small change in one of the inputs, and that gives rise to a small change in the output. But these systems don't behave like that. They're highly non-linear. They raise an input to a large power, like somebody raised to the power 8 or 9. And that means that a small change in the input or a small uncertainty in the value of an input can give rise to a huge difference in the output. So this is the realms of chaos theory, which is a branch of complex adaptive systems. And it's the example of the butterfly flapping its wings in the Philippines, giving rise to the formation of a hurricane over the North Atlantic. This is the realm that we're in. Another important property is that they are deeply interconnected. The various components of the system are deeply interconnected with one another. And that means that classic techniques of dealing with a complicated problem, of breaking it down into its component parts, getting experts to solve each of the components, and then reconstituting the whole, that method won't work because of these deep interconnections. And not only are there connections within each system, but if you have multiple systems, then there can be deep interconnections between systems. And that's very important because in recent years, the world has been undergoing simultaneous crises in 4 different complex adaptive systems in our political framework, in our economy, especially since the global financial crisis of 15 years ago. The coronavirus pandemic was a 4th one impacting our healthcare system. And the final one, there's a slow burning crisis in global climate change. And these have all been interacting with one another in complex ways, which defied the ability of experts to deal with them. And the final important aspect is their adaptivity. These systems change over time. And that means that a lot of classic techniques, especially those things that we use in financial markets, which I did as a trader and as a risk manager, we use historical data. And implicitly, when we're doing that, we're assuming that that data is a good representation of the distribution from which the future events will be drawn. We're implicitly assuming that when we're doing calculations on looking at history as a guide to the future. But because these systems are adaptive and they change over time, that's not a good assumption. It doesn't work. And for all these reasons, the complexity, the high degree of nonlinearity, the interconnections, the adaptivity, all of these reasons together are what give complex adaptive systems their special character. And it's fundamentally the reason why the future is unknowable.
Right. And that really is so people understand as a physicist, we understand it. You are able to predict the future on the basis of scientific theories and proving them are correct. You're actually able to predict the future.
I mean, there are lots of elements in physics which behave regularly. That they don't have the characteristics of these highly complex systems. So things like the solar system, for example, we understand the way the solar system works very well. We can predict with great accuracy the times of sunrise and sunset every day, the times of the tides, which are driven by the moon and its rotation around on its axis and its precession around the Earth. We know the times of the seasons. We can predict the date of the summer and winter solstices and the spring equinox and the autumn equinox and so on. We can predict all of these things with great accuracy, but that's because the solar system is not a complex adaptive system. But the kind of things that I'm talking about in the book and the way that human societies behave and the way that financial markets behave, these are these complex systems, and that's why in respect of these systems, predicting the future, frankly, is impossible.
Yeah, it's really amazing. I mean, I want you to paraphrase or give me an example. What do you want the reader to come away from the book? While you're talking about your book, I'm gonna bring up a QR code. Now you can order the book, right? Scan that QR code with your phone. You can order Paul's book right from that QR code and order it. But Paul, what do you want the reader to take away from your book?
There are several very important messages in the book. One of them is the fact that because the future is fundamentally unknowable, and we're asking our political leaders to make decisions to drive policy which will impact the way in which we live. We're asking them to create these policies within the context of this complex adaptive system where the future is unknowable. And that's inevitably when politicians make decisions and drive policy. Over time, they will make mistakes. Sometimes they will be lucky. A really smart politician, with some luck, will make decisions that work out effectively. But eventually, it's simply, the law of large numbers. Over time, they will make an accumulation of mistakes, and society will need to take a new direction. We'll need to change the policies. And because individual politicians become highly associated with the policies that they've espoused, it wouldn't be credible for a politician to say, this policy that I've argued for the last 5 years, I'm sorry, it hasn't worked. We need to change it. They couldn't retain credibility and do that. So in order to change the policy and for society to take a new direction, we need to get rid of the politician too and bring in a new set of politicians. And this is the fundamental reason why democracy is so important, because democracy gives us a peaceful means of removing one set of leaders from power and replacing them with another set of leaders. Now, autocracies don't have this luxury. In autocracies, the autocrat like Xi Jinping in China, and frankly, the way Vladimir Putin, ostensibly it's a democracy, but he's the only candidate, so he was always going to win. It's an autocracy too. When these leaders, they make bad decisions, that they make mistakes in the same way that leaders in democracies do. But in the case of autocracies, because there's no peaceful means of removing them from power, society can't take a new direction. Failing leaders tend to double down on mistakes that they've made. They tend to repress their own populations in the way that Xi Jinping is doing with the Uyghurs in Western China. They tend to wage war on their neighbors in the way that Vladimir Putin is doing in Ukraine to distract the domestic population from problems at home. So autocracies are much more likely to be troublesome, to wage war on their neighbors and to be problematic. And that's why democracy is so important, and why we should look to protect and preserve it. The fact that our economy is also a complex adaptive system underlies the reason why capitalism is the best way of economic organization. Because the fact is, the overwhelming majority of businesses fail. Business is hard. I mean, we have the idea that business is easy because we see the success of the big, the tech companies, for example, in recent years. And that gives us the false impression that business is easy, but it's not. Business is hard. Most businesses fail. And that's true in a centrally planned economy, as it is in an open, free capitalist economy. But the beauty of capitalism is that it's a filtering mechanism, a winnowing mechanism, which allows failing businesses to die quickly without destroying too much capital. It's a way of allowing the successful businesses to propagate forward into the future, and sufficient capital is left over to invest into the successful ideas so that society can make more progress. In a centrally planned economy like communism or like socialism, where I grew up in the United Kingdom in the 1970s, the government, many industries, important industries, were privatized. They make the assumption that we've got the cream of society in government and the civil service and in government. We've got the cream of society, we've got the best, smartest brains. We've got the lowest cost borrowing power of the state. So these ventures are bound to be more successful, but it doesn't work like that. The great and the good are no better at picking winning ideas or running companies effectively than are ordinary private citizens. But when they fail, when a government-backed industry fails, it fails in large scale and destroys huge amounts of capital. There's not enough capital left to enable the few successful ideas to propagate forward into the future. And that's why capitalism, over the long term, outperforms centrally planned economies. Centrally planned economies, industrial policy has a long track record of failure. This idea also underlies the importance of diversity, what I refer to as true diversity in any organization, and that's because of the adaptive nature of the society and the markets in which we operate. If the markets were immutable, if they didn't change, then although equity and it's often called diversity, equity, inclusion, the equity and inclusion elements, they would still be very important from the perspective of fairness. The fact is that historically, women, for example, and people of color have been underrepresented at senior levels of all kinds of organizations. That was deeply unfair, and gradually, thankfully, that's now being corrected. But diversity itself, and diversity is much more multifaceted than simply sex and skin color. I'm talking particularly about diversity of thought. Now, if the economic environment in which we operate didn't change, if it was immutable, then frankly, diversity wouldn't help you at all, because a set of leaders perfectly matched, a set of clones perfectly matched the environment, the operating environment, that would be the best team to have, and any changes that you made to it only ever make it worse. But of course, we don't operate in an operating environment where the background is immutable. It does change, it adapts, and it changes in ways that are completely unforecastable. And that's why having a diverse body of intelligence and the leadership of the organization, every level throughout the organization, true diversity is very powerful as a means of allowing your company or the organization that you're part of to be able to be agile and to adapt itself to the changing operations. Now, to be sure, there's no guarantees of success. Business remains very difficult. There's no guarantees of success. But if you don't have a diverse team, then you are highly likely to be setting up your company or operation to fail, because you lack that agility and resilience and the ability to adapt when the environment adapts. You lack those things, and you'll be unable to adapt your company to move forward.
And that's really the point of your book, are giving us business leaders the ability to read your book, and kind of build a philosophy or a theory on the way people are coming for success, not failure. How we can avoid failure, right?
Yeah, I mean the point, the business point behind this is that failure isn't should not be a surprise. Failure is the normal course of events, but it's our ability to pick ourselves up and dust ourselves off and start all over again. These are this grit, this resilience is the distinguishing mark between successful businesses and the not successful. That's a very important thing. Failure, in a sense, should be it should be expected and should be embraced. You should try lots of small experiments. As a physicist, a practicing physicist, physics is inherently an empirical or experimental subject. The real world is described by an infinite number of data points at every point in space and time. Obviously, we can't deal with that. We can only handle a few discrete data points. So you measure those things, you then construct a model or a theory which relates them, and it then also makes forecasts about points where you haven't yet measured. And so you use your theory to make a forecast, and then you go out into the real world and you do an experiment, and you test your forecast to see whether it was correct or not. And if it was correct, then you've expanded the range of validity of your theory. If your forecast was not correct, then you have to accept that your theory is wrong. I mean, one of the great biologists, Victorian biologist Thomas Huxley, said, "There's nothing so distressing as the destruction of a beautiful theory by an ugly fact." But facts are troublesome things. We have to live with that. So this idea of experimenting in your business, if you have a great idea for a new venture, don't go all in with too much capital, because your idea, your ability to forecast the future, forecast future demand, for example, for a product you've created, the market may simply not be there. So capitalism creates this way of doing experiments, or what the Chairman Mao, former Chairman leader, said, the idea of let 1,000 flowers bloom. Try lots of things, see which ones work, see which are the most beautiful flowers, let those carry forward, get rid of the rest. This is the way that we make progress. Even the most successful businesses, however, because of this issue of our society adapts over time, this underlies what's sometimes called in economics Schumpeterian creative destruction. Even the most successful businesses can't be guaranteed to remain successful indefinitely. Somebody else will come along with a better idea. This is the beauty of capitalism, and improve the system. And so the price we must pay for operating in this environment, which is adaptive and complex, is eternal vigilance. We could never rest on our laurels. That's something in business. You always have to be worried about your competitors and changes in your customers' needs. What they want. New products that your competitors and new services that your competitors introduce. You need to be perpetually on your toes and recognizing these changes in the market in order to be able to adapt your offering and retain your business as a successful business going forward.
Yeah, I think Paul, that in layman terms, I hear you say experiment. Don't go all in, just experiment and watch what works and what doesn't work. Really resonates with me because
Yeah.
I'm an all-in human being, and I need to stop that. So I need to look at my company and what I'm doing, marketing, whatever it may be, and do have more of a physicist mindset.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
a big.
Yeah. But the fact is that only modern humans have been on the earth now, it's thought, for more than a million years. And for nearly all of that time, life for everybody was what, in Thomas Hobbes's memorable phrase, nasty, brutish, and short. It was like that for everybody. All of the progress that we've made has occurred in just the last few hundred years, last 200 or 300 years. And all of that progress has occurred thanks to the twin developments of democracy and capitalism. And that's why it's so unfortunate, I think, that in recent years we've seen a loss of faith in democracy and in capitalism. We have partly it's been caused by things like globalization and the hollowing out of the middle classes. It was further exacerbated by the global financial crisis of 15 years ago, where people come to think that the American dream is no longer working. We no longer have a fair means of distributing the fruits of economic growth. A certain elite preferred privileged group of people are creaming off the bulk of these gains, and it's not being shared equally across society. And that's driven increased political polarization in our country, in the United States. It's driven increasing polarization in the country in which I was born, the United Kingdom. And we've seen other signs of it elsewhere in Europe as well. This loss of faith in democracy and capitalism, given that all of the progress was due to that, this loss of faith is very worrying. So in the second half of the book, what I do is I ask the question, well, why are we losing faith? I mean, there've been lots of surveys done by The Economist magazine, surveys done by Cambridge University, which demonstrate this loss of faith. People are toying with other kinds of ideas, and that's very dangerous. So, as I said, there are several things. There's globalization, but a big part of it is the global financial crisis of 15 years ago. So, I ask what caused the crisis, and there I have to lay much of the blame at the feet of the central banks, and in particular the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States. And I think they were the main cause of the crisis 15 years ago through two separate streams of activity. One is their failure to manage monetary policy effectively, and the other one is their failure to manage the banks effectively. In terms of monetary policy, I think the rot first set in with Alan Greenspan, who became Fed chairman in August 1987. He followed Paul Volcker. And just a short time after Greenspan became chairman, we had the stock market crash in October of 1987. And the Dow Jones fell by more than 508 points, so 20 standard deviation, 25% decline. And Greenspan, understandably and quite correctly at the time, flooded the market with liquidity in order to protect the banking system. But he followed similar policies throughout his tenure in 1992 with the Eurozone crisis and the ejection of sterling from what was then the exchange rate mechanism, the European currency snake. 1994 bond market collapse, 1997 the Asian financial crisis led by Thailand. Next year there was the Russia default and the failure of long-term capital management, a big US-based hedge fund. Every time there was stress in the markets, there seemed to be a crisis, the Fed would cut interest rates, flood the market with liquidity. But this became a one-sided asymmetric policy. It became known as the Greenspan put. And later on, it was adopted by the next Fed chair, Ben Bernanke put, and then the Yellen put, and so on. Greenspan would jawbone about when markets were rallying, were doing well. He would talk about irrational exuberance in the markets, but he didn't raise interest rates as aggressively as he cut them on the downside. So this asymmetric policy in interest rates led people to think the Fed's always going to have your back. They led them to invest in assets, in stocks and real estates and so on, and build up a bubble because of this asymmetric policy. A related piece of this is in terms of inflation. We have a 2% inflation target. It was formally adopted by Ben Bernanke, but there's never really any discussion of where that 2% target comes from. It was one that the Fed picked up from many central banks around the world. The Bank of England, the European Central Bank also have a 2% inflation target, picked up originally from New Zealand, but there's never been any justification for where that comes from. Now, where it comes from is the Fed is concerned, Bernanke particularly was a scholar of the Great Depression, was concerned about deflation in prices because that was seen to usher in the Great Depression. So central bankers don't want inflation to get too low because of the fear that it turns into depression. But here I think they're making a crucial mistake. The reason why the Great Depression was so bad is because we had deflation in asset prices. Farmers had borrowed money against their land holdings to buy seed and so on. We'd have the roaring 20s. Stock speculators had borrowed money to invest in stocks on margin. And it was the decline in asset prices. It was asset price deflation that was so problematic and so damaging. In contrast, deflation in the price of goods and services, that's perfectly normal. That's harmless. That's the normal state of affairs. Just look at the price of things like electronics goods, computers, TVs, cars. The price of those things goes down over time. The only sectors in the services and goods part of the economy where prices rise tends to be those where there's government regulation, and that regulation prevents the Schumpeterian creative destruction. It prevents the adoption of technology and things which will enable improve productivity in those areas. But absent government inflation, the natural course of prices in goods and services would be down over time. So we shouldn't have a 2% inflation target. We should have a 0% inflation target in goods and services. But because the Fed conflates asset price deflation, which is really bad, with deflation in the price of goods and services, which is completely benign and harmless, it deliberately runs monetary policy with interest rates too low. And too low interest rates encourage people to buy pre-existing assets, use cheap leverage to buy pre-existing assets. All that does is pump up the price of assets, price of equities, bonds, the price of real estate, and so on. Now, of course, when you've got a bubble in asset prices, what happens when you do that? Eventually the bubble bursts and you get the asset price collapse. You get the very thing that the Fed should care about the most, because of its inadvertent focus on the wrong thing, trying to stave off deflation in goods and services, it brings about a bubble in asset prices, which then brings about a collapse in asset prices, the very thing that it cares about the most. So I say in the book, this is such a crazy policy that it would be funny were its consequences not so serious.
Yeah, I mean, let's look at the world today. It's there, my opinion.
Yeah.
And you're seeing, so let me just start giving my basic view of it. Take the last few minutes of a show. This morning, I don't even know, I watched the news. Iran declared war with Israel and the United States, which is really unusual. So, what is the effect of war on the economy, and what could we look forward to as really going to this World War III?
Well, and in the short term, obviously very, very dangerous, leads to a tremendous amount of uncertainty, to spike in oil prices, things like that. So in the very short term, very dangerous. But in the longer term, economies tend to look through wars, and certainly the financial markets, which are forward-looking, tend to look through the immediate impacts of the war, and over time they will tend to recover. So if provided you don't have too much leverage that you can get squeezed out of your positions in the initial sell-off, if you can hold on to your positions, you're much better off doing that and looking through the time of the war to the recovery, which will be there on the other side.
Well, that's pretty, Paul, I told you 30 minutes ago, but it's so quick. And sure enough, we're at the end of 30 minutes. But
yeah, that's a pity.
There's something I do want to ask. We're seeing record inflation. We're seeing what's going on in our economy now. Give me what's your opinion of what the current economic, where we're at economically, where we're at.
I think the big problem that we have is that the government, it's not just the United States governments in developed economies around the world are far too indebted. We've built up a huge fiscal debt to GDP ratio. It's about 127%. It's well north of the level of 90%, which two researchers from Harvard, Carmen Reinhardt and her husband Kenneth Rogoff, demonstrated that a 90% debt to GDP ratio is the threshold level above which that can lead to economic collapse. And we're well above that. We were above that after the global financial crisis. It only came down a little bit, and then with all the new debt that was issued to try to get through the coronavirus crisis, it jumped to north of 130%. That debt is represents a huge drag on economic growth because it represents future potential economic activity that's been brought forward to today. That's what debt is, in effect. It's bringing forward future consumption to today, and it's now in the past. So having been consumed already, it can't now be consumed again. And that's a big problem. That's going to act as a huge drag on growth. All of the ways of dealing with that debt are bad. The only thing is, the government could default on it. That would be terrible. That really would give rise to a massive economic problem, worldwide problem. It can be reduced by higher taxes to pay back the debt, but that's going to be a huge drag on economic growth. We could try to inflate it away, and that happens because the debt exists in notional terms, whereas GDP growth is total GDP growth would grow simply with inflation. Having high inflation would reduce the debt to GDP ratio by that mechanism. But we know that inflation is very bad. We can just see the effects of letting the inflation genie out of the bottle over the last couple of years. It tends to impact the poor and people on fixed incomes much more than it impacts others. It's a very bad policy. All of the ways of dealing with the debt are bad. There isn't a good solution. I suspect we'll try to muddle through. The best solution would be economic growth, and that there are some hopes out there for things like artificial intelligence that might boost productivity and generate real economic growth, so we can grow ourselves out of the problem. But that's very difficult because the debt itself acts as a huge drag on the very economic growth you need to get to deal with it. So unfortunately, we've allowed ourselves to get into a really bad position. We should not have done that. That was a big mistake. The problem is we were told by our political leaders, deficits don't matter. We were told by Dick Cheney, and he was vice president under George W. Bush, that deficits don't matter. Well, deficits don't matter until suddenly they do. And by the time they do,
Right.
it's too late.
Right. Well, Abe, I can't think enough. We just scratched the surface. So hopefully you'll come back on my show, and
I would love to, Aaron.
Yeah, I want to get more. I want to get more into. I don't know if you can talk about your work in Switzerland or not. I do know something about it, so I would like to talk to you sometime about it. But I want to give our audience the opportunity. There, right here. I forgot to tell you, you can order your book here. Also, you're giving away a free chapter.
That's right. That's right. If you go to my website, paulsinsights.com, you can download a free chapter about complex adaptive systems, get a taster of what the book's about.
That really is. I highly recommend that. Paul, I want to thank you so much for being there again. We're over time, but I really appreciate you being
Thank you,
here.
Aaron.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aaron. The pleasure was all mine.
Have a great day, Paul.
Thanks. Bye-bye.